Okay, so this is part 4 of my MIP 410 Legend project. So as you can probably see, I have the rear gearbox installed and the belt installed, and the front end is more or less finished. So I'll go over what is new since the last time. So starting with the front end, one of the things I mentioned in, I believe it was part 3, was that for the front gearbox, the diff outdrive clearance against the shock tower is pretty tight, and the only way to make sure there's no binding is to mount the shock tower to the bulkhead with a button head screw, which is like a shallow domed shaped head. But it turns out that although that's fine for the for the outdrives, the dog bones that I'm using, these Yokomo dog bones, the dog bone pins are a bit wider than the diff outdrive, and so the pins will hit against the screw head. So what I had to do was take this whole thing apart and actually countersink the mounting holes for the shock tower to the bulkhead and use the flathead shaped screws to mount the shock tower. Okay, so that's one update. The other thing, as you can see, is I have the steering rack installed, and this is a J-Concepts blue aluminum steering rack for the RC10 Classic and Worlds car. So the thing about this is, if you were to mount a Worlds front end, which is to say to use an RC10T front nose plate and front shock tower on an RC10 conventionally, you would need to use the RC10T steering rack, which has a longer arm on the rack. But because we have this front gearbox that we're kind of mashing in here, that gives us less space for the steering rack, so we need a rack with a shorter arm. And it turns out, just by coincidence, that the RC10 rack is just the right size to fit against this longer nose, and also have the gearbox in here and have everything clear just fine. So as you can see, the center drag link there clears okay against the belts. There's no like binding or anything. It's pretty tight, but it clears. And let's see, so that should cover the front end part. The way that I managed to run the belts is kind of interesting. So as I mentioned, the length of this belt is longer than the stock belt for the 410 Legend. And it's, I think I kind of overestimated how much length I actually needed, so I had to pick up the slack with some rollers. So what I did at the front here was, for this screw that mounts the front nose brace tube, I just used a longer screw, I think a 1-inch screw, and then I mounted this guy here, and then two 3mm by 10mm flanged bearings back to back with the flanges on the outside to guide the belts here and here. So this white plastic piece here is from the Yokomo YZ10 870C, and it's part of the belt roller that used to exist on that chassis. So I had a spare one, I just took it off, cleaned it up, and I mounted it on here. So I have 3x10mm bearings over here on this screw, and another set of 3x10 bearings here. So the belt goes over these bearings and under these bearings, and this basically presses down on the belt to keep the tension fine. Now, if I'm honest, the belt alignment is not exactly perfect. The belt is a little crooked as it comes into the pulley on the front gearbox, and that just, I think, has to do with just the spacing of, where these bearings are and how I have to sort of force it to one side on the bottom to get this all to work. What I could do is use a longer screw here to fit maybe some spacers here to push this whole assembly out. But the problem with doing that is then the actual ball stud to the steering rack would not be able to fit around this roller assembly. So it's really a trade-off between having clearance with this ball stud and having, this belt straight. It's not a perfect setup, but what I have here works so far. We'll see what happens when I actually mount a ball cup onto this, because I tend to use these thicker RPM ball cups. Hopefully there's enough clearance to clear this lock nut here that's on the other side. It might be a little tight, but we'll see how that goes. So going out to the rear, We have your typical sort of hole here that you have to cut in the rear bulkhead. I tried to cut as large of an opening as I could to make sure I have sufficient space for the top part and bottom part of the belts. Basically, that requires you to cut out, the fourth mounting hole for the shock tower. So there's 1, 2, 3, and then there would be a 4 screw down here, but this whole region you have to cut out. So the shock tower only mounts with these 3 screws here, okay? But it still, it holds just fine. Going to the rear here, there are a few things to point out. So I have another belt roller over here. Now with the MIP kit, let me see if I have, no, I don't have it readily available. But the original 410 Legend kit came with a little plastic piece that you mounted 1 or 2 bearings on, and then you glued that to the wall of the rear bulkhead, and then that would provide some tension to the rear belt. But I wanted to try something different, and so what I instead did was for the 4th screw that mounts the motor plate to the gearbox, I just got a longer screw, a 1.5 inch screw, and on that extra 1/2 inch, I mounted some spacers and some 3x6mm bearings, flange bearings, again, back to back, similar to what I did on the front here. And that acts as my belt roller for the rear. Now, for this rear pulley, I had mentioned in the beginning that I wanted to try to get the slipper assembly going on this rear belt pulley. But it turns out that that's maybe not practical to do. I tried to find a spring washer that would be suitable for this and some slipper pads, like, these associated high torque slipper pads. These actually are not high friction enough to really provide enough grip here. And also there's not a whole lot of threading left on this screw, so it's really tight to fit 2 slipper pads plus some kind of spring assembly and tighten it down. So I instead had to just go with kind of a locked setup here, just either tighten this down as hard as I could. I tried doing that, but the metal slipper plate to metal pulley friction is low enough that even if I tighten this nut down, it still slips. So I just had to put a little bit of blue Loctite on the output shaft to sort of hold this pulley in place. Okay, so I would rather not have to do that, but I was kind of forced to based on the way this thing is working. The gearbox itself is an original Stealth gearbox. Let me see if I can find, a second, throw my box of parts here. I just had it. Here we go. Okay, so this is the re-released gearbox. The other half is in there somewhere, but this is sufficient to illustrate the point. So you can tell that it's a re-released gearbox because you have these extra sort of structural support points here, okay? But you can also tell it's a re-released. This is on the other side of the Stealth gearbox. Here you have these little sort of extra pieces on the original Stealth gearbox that would slot into to this motor mount side, right? This is just a one-piece molded unit. And also on the inside where the idler gear mounts is different. This is a bit more like a B4 or T4 idler gear setup where you mount the bearings inside the idler gear and then they slot onto a fixed shaft and the idler shaft mounts into this hole here. Now that means that the idler gear rotates around the idler shaft. But on the original RC10, the idler gear was connected to the idler shaft, and the shaft itself rotated on bearings that were mounted in the housing here. But that doesn't work for this re-released gearbox. So if you had to, say, drill a hole to fit this output shaft, it wouldn't really work because this output shaft needs to rotate on a bearing, and that bearing would have to sit in here. And this inner diameter here is just the right size for the output shaft, but then it would just, if it were to spin, it would just spin against this plastic housing here, generate friction. So I thought about maybe grinding all this stuff out and fitting a bearing inside this larger opening here, but that size of that opening is something like 15-30 seconds of an inch. It's like almost half an inch, but not quite. And I couldn't really find an actual bearing that would fit perfectly in here. So I decided to just, not use the re-released gearbox and go with one of my original stealth gearboxes. So, okay, I guess I just had to do that. One thing to point out with this pulley is that it does rub up against this little notch here on the left side of the gearbox. So on the original stealth gearbox, this piece was an actual piece that would pop into the gearbox housing. So you have to just pop it out and kind of shave it down a little bit just to make some space so that the pulley itself doesn't rub up against this little dimple here that comes out of the gearbox. Okay. Let's see. As you can see, this is a J Concepts black anodized motor plate. What else did I do? I have a Hydra drive, a low-C Hydra drive unit on this side. I figured this would be time period appropriate. This is a brand new unit, and I just wanted to, build one and see what it was like. Basically, for those who aren't familiar with the Hydra drive, comparing that to a conventional slipper clutch is a lot like comparing an automatic transmission to a manual transmission. So on a normal slipper clutch, you have, say, 2 slipper pads and some slipper plates that press against those pads, and the pads press against the spur gear. And you adjust how much force you're pressing those plates against those pads to determine how much power is coupled through those pads to the drivetrain and how much is dissipated through the pads, much like a normal clutch in a manual transmission. With a Hydra drive unit, you basically have a chamber that's filled with fluid, and inside that chamber is a fan. And the fan tries to spin against that fluid, and that creates resistance, and that resistance is effectively coupled to the drivetrain. So very similar to an automatic transmission where you have a viscous fluid and some kind of fan or an impeller blade, and the viscosity of that fluid determines how much power is coupled from the fan through the fluid to some other fan that connects to the rest of the drivetrain. Okay, so here what you have is on the output shaft, it connects to that fan piece on the inside of the housing, and that tries to spin against the fluid that's inside this housing. And depending on how much fluid's in there and the viscosity of fluid, it determines how much power is coupled to the drivetrain. Now, this Hydra drive unit isn't just this though, because on the other side, you do still have a slipper clutch, a conventional slipper clutch. It's just that the Hydra drive goes on the other side. So instead of having 2 slipper pads in a conventional slipper system, one on the inside, one on the outside you have a Hydra drive unit. So I hope that's a sufficient explanation that more or less covers what a Hydra drive does. This is not really something you would use on modern tracks. It's more for older tracks that are like loamy dirt or low traction surfaces, where you want maybe a little bit slower uptake on your slipper clutch type of unit. Modern slippers are much more abrupt. So, on a high grip surface, you wouldn't need this. It would actually slow you down. But it was very effective back in the day. And, Brian Kinwald used one in his, to win the 1993 IFMAR Worlds on his old RC10. Okay, anyway, enough of that. So this is where we are. I'm reasonably satisfied with how the belt assembly has gone. Basically, all that's left is to put the rear suspension on, the rear arms and the rear hub carriers, and then put the shocks on, and then it's more or less finished. I got to mount the wheels and everything. So I'll get to that soon and make another video. But in the meantime, thanks for watching.